Hello and welcome back. I gave you a bit of a bum steer at the last one, saying that this week we'd be talking about prune. Well, I jumped the gun. Prune's a bit down the track. We've still got a lot of Mzilikazi to talk about before we go there. But I know one of the things that was confusing me a little bit was I just finished the story of Mochori and the children up in the Magaliesberg and talked about how Mochori went to Kuruman mission and he then found out all the children learned how about carpentry and metalworking and the forge and all this sort of thing. Then drew the corollary with Temba, one of my characters and one of my friends at Mzingwane and Chilocho. And his father was on my father's staff and he was in charge of carpentry and metalwork. Quite possibly learned at Kuruman. Anyway, that led me on, and what I meant to end up last week with was that there was a very bright young man at that school whom Dad was really keen to see get through to taking his Cambridge School certificate. In order to do that, he offered him a tutorship working in conjunction with Temba's father, doing teaching, carpentry, and metalwork. And his name was Joshua Nkomo. So there we have this extraordinary situation where I was just so fortunate with Dad being in African education that I grew up with and knew so many key players in the future of the country. In fact, in those days, Mum didn't drive, and we used to have to go off in a battered old green truck to Bulawayo to buy things that she needed or go to doctors or whatever. And frequently I would be left in the cab and Joshua would look after me. I was about 2 or 3 at the time. And she said that I knew to look out for Joshua whenever we were going off on a trip, which must have been a highlight of the occasion. And I used to stand on the veranda at Mzingwane shouting out, "Joshua, come in, Joshua, come in." So there you are. And he looked after me wonderfully. It was good, and I remember him very well as a young man. Still could never quite get used to the older version of him. But anyway, so there he was, another little anecdote. All right, so where were we? Mochori and the children, a great little story backing up one of the characters that I had brought in to discuss all the vagaries of that history. Because every time I looked for something, I'd find 4 people had written exactly the same article with 4 different conclusions. And so often it was little Freddie trying to write home to Mum to assure her that he was the hero of the hour in Matabeleland, or somebody who wanted to be appointed to some key position in the government. All vested interest stuff, and it became rather exhausting, I have to confess. But anyway, using the 4 children to talk about it, to debate it, each of them with a different perspective, and to arrive at their conclusions, also leaving you to arrive at yours, was ultimately how the whole thing got put together and where all the research came from. So where are we at? Well, we're still with Mzilikazi. And just to recap, he crossed the Limpopo because he was being chased by the Boers. The Boers were in turn trying desperately to distance themselves from the British. Okay. The Limpopo, he got the bulk over, estimated about 20,000 people that he got, the size of the Matabele then. And he asked his uncle, Godwan Ndweni, to please take them over and find a capital in what was to become Matabeleland. But he still wasn't too happy with the Limpopo because it goes dry quite a lot. And he needed a more defensible frontier, and that obviously was going to be the Zambezi. So off he goes to the Zambezi, bumps into the Makololo, and they had guns. And guns against his little Ikwa spears was never going to be productive. But it took him about 2 years to get back. And in that time, Chief Ndweni had got Bulawayo pretty well established thanks to another chief called Mbigo, who was head of the Zwangendaba regiment. This was the crack regiment of the Matabeles. And over a period of about 2 years, he gradually subdued the Changumira of the Rojvi people, who were by that stage pretty well scattered all over today's Midlands Mashonaland area. So there were these chiefs all working together, but Mzilikazi hadn't been there for 2 years, which meant that the tribe was getting very restless. It was the duty of the king to, at the Inkwala, to throw the spear, and that would give them the direction in which they were to go to find new cattle, new brides, whatever else they needed. He hadn't been there. Nobody else was entitled to do it. Right. Who is the successor? And the successor was Nkulumani. Now, Nkulumani, how does the succession work? Well, it's a pretty critical one. And that was that only Nkuluman was eligible at that stage because he was born after King Mzilikazi was inaugurated. Mzilikazi might have had 2 or 3 other kids before that, but they didn't count. So Nkuluman was the man. So Chief Godwan Ndwene decided that he was going to be the one, and preparations started to inaugurate him as the new Matabele chief. Well, there's a thing called the Bush Telegraph, which anybody who's lived there knows about and how quickly it travels, and zoop, off it went. And before you knew where you were, there was Mzilikazi storming back, furious to think that this could possibly have happened. He arrived back in Bulawayo with people thronging up as far as Chilocho trying to appease him. No, he was not to be appeased. He got back to Bulawayo and up to Ntabazinduna mountain and through, again, estimates vary from 80 to 300 people off the top of Ntabazinduna mountain. All those who had been involved in the plot against him. So it was a pretty fearsome thing to do, but he was absolutely determined nobody was going to possibly try and take over his chieftainship. It was one problem, though. That was Nkulumani disappeared at that point. And the only other pretender to the throne was Jandu. Now, Jandu was this little sickly boy who had been the son of a Swazi princess, Mzilikazi's latest wife, and she had been given a present of this little girl, Sarah Liebenberg. Sarah became Jandu's nursemaid. And obviously, when all this was happening at Ntabazinduna, it is quite likely and verified from several sources where I kept picking up these little bits and pieces that Chief Nkumbata and Sarah took him off and hid him in the Matopas. So, as far as anybody knew, he was the only one likely to succeed Mzilikazi. But I suspect Mzilikazi was pretty fierce man. He was not even talking about anybody likely to succeed him. So don't you talk about him, or else I'll blot him off. So Jandu, some question as to whether he was actually ever accepted in the court, whether Mzilikazi actually ever allowed him to come to court. So how did Mzilikazi eventually arrive at this highly disciplined tribe of people, the Matabele, and they're incorporating tribes of all sorts? I mean, even today you've got 6 or 7, 8 different languages, all within that Matabele framework, Kalanga, Venda, all the others. Well, Mzilikazi chose the young men that he would train up for his regiments very carefully, building an impressive tribe of even more physically strong, intelligent and courageous people. Mzilikazi was doing with humans what we would do with cows to produce a better, stronger strain of cows. He was powerful, but he was cruel to those who did not submit to his authority or who did the wrong thing. Once they became Amandebele, they then became part of the family. And to them, the king was generous and gracious. And that comes across time and time again. Extraordinary man. His father, or Lobengula's father, had a close relationship with Robert Moffat at Kuruman, as we have mentioned before. And that was why he named his eldest legitimate son, or the next in line for the throne, Nkulumani. Now, I had always heard about Nkulumani before from my father, because he was often talking about him, but I never asked the questions. It's ridiculous, isn't it? So, in writing all the book, we went to visit Ntumbane, which was where Mzilikatsi's grave is purported to be. Nowadays, you walk up a rather dusty little drive to get up to the top, where there's a little sign that says Mzilikatsi's grave. They read the signpost and then walked quietly up the hill called Entumbane to the stone walls guarding the king's grave. They could see long slabs of granite standing on end at the entrance to a deep cleft. Carol felt overwhelmed by an extraordinary sense of presence, which increased her disbelief that she'd never bothered to make an effort to go there when she was still at school in Bulawayo. She looked across at Prune, and he had an expression almost of fear in his face and seemed reluctant to come any closer. So she stepped up to read the plaque on the side of the granite rock. Mzilikatsi, son of Shobana, the Matebele hail you. The mountain fell down on the 5th of September 1868. All nations acclaim the son of Shobana, Hayete. So there's the date of his death, 1868. He was actually estimated to be about 78 at that time. And he'd only spent 28 of those years in Matabeleland. Now, just a little quick memory jog. When Moffat went up to see him, he would have been about 71, 72 years old already by that stage. So he was quite an old man in terms of what elderliness was in those days, which is a lot more than it is now. In amongst it all, there was a family appointed to guard this grave. And it was such an important family that they all lived in a village around the grave, so that nobody would ever have a chance to break in or to steal anything from the grave. Inside, Mzilikatsi had many people with him, willing wives, servants, etc., plus all his most important things that were buried with him. And he was buried in the traditional pose of a Matebele or Zulu king. So all was going well. The guards were in place. They had 2 Martini Henry rifles, which Mzilikatsi had been given by somebody, and those were enough to keep people away. But one day, they weren't enough to keep a bushfire away. And this bushfire roared through and burnt anything flammable. And of course, and Lobengula was so angry that he had every member of that family killed. So it's sad from our perspective because with them went the stories. And so all that family went, and so did the grave. And shortly afterwards, somebody broke in. True to type, isn't it? Fortunately, in a way, he then tried to sell it to a man called Captain Fortescue, who was with the British Army in Bulawayo. Fortescue then sent it to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I am sending by the bearer, who brings this small parcel, a bangle, the history of which is that it was taken off the skeleton of King Mselikatsi when his grave was opened. I was told it resembled the metal used for armaments of the Phoenicians. Of this, you'll be a better judge than I am. I can vouch for the authenticity of the bangle, as it was given to me when I was in Bulawayo in 1896 by the man who opened the grave. I shall be very glad to give it to the museum if you consider it worthy. It is still in the Victoria and Albert Museum to this day, and that is the bangle that I have depicted on the front of this particular video log. So, a sad end in the defiling of that particular grave of Mzilikatsi. But in 1941, the Governor-General of Southern Rhodesia at that time, Sir Herbert Stanley, opened a monument to Mzilikatsi. And he opened it quite close to where the grave is, just down the hill, at where it is presumed he had built his first capital, Nhlanhlandela, same name as the one he had had near the Magaliesberg. The area around the grave entrance was tidy, with the grass cut short, but without the signpost, it would have been easy to miss. A short walk down the hill from the graveside was the old monument to Mzilikazi, erected in 1941. Angus pointed to the right and he said, "Do you see that big old oak tree, or the big old tree there behind the monument? The one that looks as though it's dying?" asked Prune. "That's the one. Unfortunately, people keep pinching little bits of bark, believing it will heal them, and now it's almost dead. But use your imagination, because this is one of the sites thought to be the original capital of Nhlahlandlela. We might be standing in the Bokral. This was the most important place in the king's capital. Anyone wanting to see the king would come here. Their meetings, or their indabas, as they're still called, of course, would take place under that old tree. And of course, by just the nod of his head or the twitch of his whisk, many people were condemned to death right here. That was the price of the king's displeasure. Now, there is always another viewpoint, and this is an important one, because it is traditional among several of the Matabele tribes. I don't think all of them, I couldn't establish that, but that ordinary people should never know where the king's grave was. But there are also writings that probably almost definitely guarantee that that is, in fact, King Mzilikazi's grave. So that's another of the imponderables that we have to look at. But how sad that anybody would break in and steal that bangle. Anyway, so there we were. So King Mzilikazi had 28 years in Matabeleland, and they were gentle years. They were good years, productive years, during which time the tribe grew and prospered, and Mzilikazi himself had very little trouble. To put it into perspective, the Berlin Conference, which caused a whole heap of trouble in that last remaining section of Africa, only took place 15, 16 years later than that, right in the middle of Lobengula's reign. So he was the one who really copped it. King Mzilikazi was still able to lead the life of a Matabele king. But when he died, all hell broke loose, because there was no heir. Nkuluman had disappeared. Nobody knew whether he'd been thrown off Ntabazinduna or where he'd got to. There still is doubt about that. But there are a few odd little bits that you can sort of track around. There are stories that he went to Bechuanaland and that he went back down to Kuruman, and he became a Christian and decided there's no way he wanted to be on the throne of Matabeleland anyway, so he made jolly sure nobody found him. That's one of the stories. Even today, there's still confusion, as I mentioned. There is a grave in Bafokeng, which is near Rustenburg, again in that same sort of quarter of Kuruman and Pretoria off into Bechuana or Botswana. And that grave says, Inkosi za Mzilikazi uKhulumane wafa nenyaka 1883 nenyaka August 21. So my very bad reading of Sindebele, it sort of means King of the Matabele Mzilikazi's son uKhulumane Mzilikazi died August the 21st, 1883. So I remember Dad always saying it would have been so much stronger for the Matabele if not only Rhodes's son, Lobengula's son, had survived, but Nkuluman. And at the time he was saying that, and that would have been in the 40s, 50s, there was no certainty that any of them had any further issue, any more likely Matabele kings, should we say. So what was going to happen? So here we had Jandu, who had been taken into the Matopos by Mkumbata and little Sarah Liebenberg, and he had never really been allowed into the court because he was Tagati, he was, you don't want you around, you're a pretender to my throne, you should have been thrown off in Ntabazinduna, I don't know how you escaped type attitude. Nobody knows. Some say yes, he probably was accepted in some form, some say he wasn't. In the meantime, Lobengula, who'd been brought up with a little white nanny, had three great friends. He was known at that time as Jandu, And these three friends were Sam Phillips, who became known as Induna Sam. They'd known each other since they were young boys. And the others were Frederick Courtenay-Selous and Robert Baden-Powell. Now, King Solomon's Mines was written about that time by Rider Haggard. And the character of Allan Quatermain was based on Courtenay-Selous. And it created havoc for Matabeleland because the gold was beginning to diminish in Victoria and Australia. The Yukon hadn't proved to have enough gold for the voracious mines that now wanted it. South Africa, they were finding gold, but it was mostly the claims were all taken. Suddenly, there was King Solomon's Mines, the biggest of all time. Well, poor old Lobengula had to cope with all that fallout. So this was all building up at the time when they were beginning to think about trying to find another king. So, in fact, they were all hunting together in the Mazoe district, Lobengula and his friends, when he heard that Mzilikazi had died. He would have been infuriated, upset, angry, determined to disappear if he could. But unlike Nkuluman, he was here. He couldn't just disappear. So off he went to a friend called Thomas, who was actually running the mission at Inyati at that stage. And Thomas wrote a lot of bits and pieces about that time, and he recorded the only times Jandu left the mission was to travel to Njelele in the Matopos to see Mlimo. There's a lot to say that, in fact, one of the distinctions and one of the things that created him as king was that he had been trained by the Mlimo in the Matopos. Interesting. So Lobengula kept encouraging the Nkulumane factions to keep looking for Nkuluman, and he reminded them that he was, after all, the son of a despised Swazi woman. One of the leaders of the Nkuluman faction was Chief Mbigo, the one who had held the Zwangan Daba tribe, taken them through. He was a hero in the eyes of the Matabele, and he was married to a sister of Nkuluman. He was determined to find Nkuluman. But on the other hand, you had Chief Nkumbata, who had taken Jandu and hidden him in the Matopos. He knew Nkuluman had gone, and he was determined to get Jandu onto the throne. So, mayhem all over the show. And there was a lot of toing and froing and anger and all this sort of thing. And eventually, Nkumbata came to Jandu after about 2 years of trying to sort this out and said, "Sorry, mate, you're it." And all the other kings and chiefs came and brought their cattle as a sign of their fealty and their loyalty. And reluctantly, Jandu had to accept the mantle as the next king. Now, in oral history records, we believe, as I mentioned, that it was because he was trained by the Mlimo that he became a final choice as king of the Matabele. Taught at Njelele, very, very important. All the Matabele people respected as a spirit medium and a rainmaker. Chief Mbigo still refused to recognize him, and it took almost 2 years after his inauguration for Lobengula eventually to subdue the Zwangendaba. Chief Mbigo had to go, and it is presumed that Lobengula would have dealt the final blow. So, interesting. But I don't think for a million years poor old Lobengula imagined just what lay ahead of him. More stories for next time. Thank you for being with me. It's quite a tale, one way and another, and I hope you got all the details down relatively easily.